Changing your lifting routine too frequently is generally not ideal to maximize long-term muscle growth. But there are times where switching up your routine can be beneficial if implemented at the right time. But when should you change your routine? And what variables should be changed? First, let's cover how often we should change exercises. This refers to how often we change an exercise which trains the same muscle group. For example, switching from a squat to a leg press. So how does changing exercises affect muscle growth? Well, it seems that changing exercises too frequently can impede muscle growth. This was observed in this study, which compared the effects of performing the same exercises versus switching exercises every workout. 19 men with at least 2 years lifting experience performed one of either the following lower body training routines 2 times per week. Half the subjects performed back squats, deadlifts, leg press, hip thrusts, leg extensions, and leg curls each workout, while the other half performed 3 quad dominant and 3 posterior chain dominant leg exercises each workout too, but these were randomly chosen each session from an app. After 8 weeks, it was found that both groups experienced significant increases in quadriceps muscle thickness, but the consistent training routine resulted in slightly superior growth for each quad muscle. So while we can still achieve muscle growth by changing exercises every workout, we would ideally want to keep our exercise selection consistent to maximize muscle growth. It is recommended to keep an exercise consistent in your training program for at least around 6 weeks before changing it to a new variation. Although we shouldn't get the idea of changing exercises confused with exercise variation. This refers to the number of exercises a muscle group is trained within an exercise routine. While hypertrophy can certainly be achieved by training a muscle with only a single exercise, training a muscle with multiple exercises usually produces slightly superior growth. This was seen in this study, which compared the effects of training with a single versus multiple exercises for each muscle group on hypertrophy. 22 men that hadn't performed resistance training in the last 4 months performed one of the following workouts 3 times per week for 9 weeks. One group performed the same exercises each session, while the other group performed a different exercise variant training the same muscle group in each of the 3 workouts. But importantly, these exercises were consistent each week for the entire 9 weeks. It was found that both groups experienced significant increases in thickness of all muscles measured, although there was a trend favouring overall growth for the group performing more exercise variants. Furthermore, the magnitude of benefit a muscle group experiences from exercise variety is likely influenced by its anatomy. Muscle groups like the chest and back have many different fibers which produce different functions. These muscle groups are likely to benefit more from greater exercise variety since different variations will bias certain fibers over others. Whereas muscles like the biceps and calves have more uniform muscle fiber orientations and perform fewer functions. These muscles therefore might not benefit from a large variety of exercises in a training program to the same magnitude. One way in which changing exercises can be useful for hypertrophy is as a form of progression. Throughout the course of our lifting career, we might change exercises to increase the stress we impose on the target muscle. This can be implemented based on our current strength levels and our rate of muscle growth and strength gains over time. For example, a lifter might start with push-ups on a box or a bench as a chest exercise. As they develop muscle and strength over time, they might progress to push-ups on the ground, which will be a little more difficult. Another more difficult progression can then be to perform push-ups holding dumbbells to produce a deficit. And eventually, if a trainee becomes very strong at push-ups, they might need to switch to a barbell or dumbbell bench press to use enough load. Moving on, the next variable we might want to change over time is volume. In the context of hypertrophy training, volume refers to the total number of sets a muscle group is trained with per week. This can be manipulated by altering the number of exercises the muscle is trained with, the number of sets performed, and the number of workouts performed per week. Based on current evidence, the relationship between volume and hypertrophy theoretically seems to look something like this. Significant muscle growth can be achieved even with low volumes, but training with more volume typically results in a faster rate of growth. Although this isn't a linear relationship. In other words, training with higher volumes seems to yield less additional muscle growth. And the point at which significant diminishing returns start to exist seems to be when training a muscle with more than around 20 sets per week. In terms of changing volume, we don't necessarily need to change volume at all. However, there are a few reasons why we might want to change our volume throughout our lifting careers. The first is to use volume as a way to progress training. In the initial stages of lifting, even minimal amounts of volume are able to result in significant muscle growth. But as a lifter becomes more advanced, our rate of muscle growth slows down. And one way to expedite our rate of growth can be to increase volume. In theory, if we were to perform the exact same training program with the exact same volume for multiple years consistently, we would initially see significant muscle growth, but this would slow down over time. Increasing volume can be a way to see another spike in muscle growth once it starts to slow down. For example, this study analysed the influence of changes in training volume on muscle growth using data from 3 different studies. Subjects from these studies were grouped into 3 different categories based on their change in volume from their habitual training routine. One group was classified as training with less than their previous volume, second was those training with up to a 50% increase in volume, and third were those training with more than 50% of their previous volume. There was enough data to assess muscle growth for 2 muscle groups, the biceps and triceps. In all groups, both biceps and triceps muscle thickness increased to some extent. However, greater increases were seen in the 2 groups whose volume was increased from previous levels. Furthermore, the magnitude of progression we experience from increasing volume is also dependent on your initial volume levels. If volume was initially very low, then an increase in volume will likely produce more noticeable muscle growth progression. Whereas if volume was already moderate or high, then the additional rate of muscle growth will likely be less apparent. And probably a more relevant reason to change volume is in response to practical constraints. As discussed, muscle growth can be achieved even with low volumes, but higher volumes tend to produce a faster rate of growth. Although we don't always have the luxury of performing as much volume as we like. More volume takes more time and effort to perform. And based on our current lifestyle, we might not feasibly be willing to put in the time and effort required to maximize our rate of muscle growth. So rather than going for what is hypothetically optimal, we should probably aim for a level of volume that is realistic and sustainable for our current lifestyle and priorities at any given time. This will look different for different individuals and will likely change over time. For example, a student with minimal responsibilities might have more time and willingness to train with higher volumes if muscle growth is a high priority to them. Whereas someone with full-time work and dependent children might not have the mental capacity or willingness to train with as much volume. So practically speaking, we might decide to change the amount of volume we train with based on our current practical constraints. And as mentioned, this can be manipulated by altering the number of exercises a muscle is trained with, the number of sets performed, or the number of workouts performed per week. The next reason that we might decide to change our training routine is due to joint stress. High levels of joint stress can sometimes result in joint pain or irritation, and pushing through this often makes the issue worse and can eventually lead to long-term injury if not managed appropriately. And if we are injured, we probably aren't able to provide a good hypertrophy stimulus to the relevant muscles. Luckily, hypertrophy training is a forgiving adaptation, and it can be achieved using a variety of different training methods. So if you were feeling joint pain or irritation from lifting, there are ways to change our training routine to limit this without compromising the training stimulus. First is that you might want to check your technique to make sure you are lifting with decent form. This includes controlling the eccentric, maintaining control throughout the entire range of motion you are training through, avoid bouncing out of the bottom position for relevant lifts, and avoid using too much external momentum. In many cases, training with effective technique limits the load you are able to use, and therefore reduces joint stress while providing an equivalent or potentially superior hypertrophy stimulus. The second variable you can change are rep ranges. If a certain exercise causes joint stress, training with a higher rep range may be helpful. This is because it will again limit the absolute load you are able to use. And as long as you are still taking the set close to failure and aren't going above around 30 reps, you will still achieve equivalent muscle growth. And third is to change exercises. Some exercises just aren't well suited for some people and cause joint stress. This could be due to the mechanics of the lift, your anatomical structure, or how the equipment is manufactured. In any case, if a certain exercise causes joint pain, you can simply switch to another variation that trains the same muscle group. Changing these variables in the following ways won't compromise the hypertrophic stimulus you provide. Although, if you have tried these strategies and the joint pain isn't subsiding, then you might need to try reducing volume, training further from failure, or reducing the weight you lift for a temporary period of time. This will probably result in a slightly inferior hypertrophy stimulus for a temporary period of time, but it may be necessary for the joint pain to subside. Another legitimate reason to change your lifting routine is simply due to mental monotony. Even if there isn't a sound physiological rationale for changing any variables, you may decide to change your routine to make it more enjoyable. Changing variables introduces novelty, which often makes us feel more engaged and more motivated to train. Going back to a study we previously mentioned, another factor the researchers looked at was training motivation. This was the study which compared the effects of performing consistent exercises each week versus having exercises randomly selected each workout. Although muscle growth was slightly superior in the group performing consistent exercises, psychological outcomes were a little different. The group performing consistent exercises saw a slight decrease in intrinsic motivation scores when comparing the beginning of the program to the end, while the variable exercise group experienced a slight increase in motivation. This suggests that changing exercises, or any other variable for that matter, might give you a slight motivation boost. So if you were feeling a little bored or demotivated with the same routine, it might be worth changing some exercises or switching up some other variables in your routine. And as long as you don't do this too frequently, it is unlikely that you will be compromising long-term muscle growth. And the last potential reason we may decide to change our training routine is if our goals change. We can use resistance training for different purposes, such as to build muscle mass, gain strength, or to help improve athletic performance. And our specific goals may change over time, or the amount of effort we decide to put towards a specific goal may also change. For example, someone may want to maximize muscle growth at all costs at some point in their life. This lifter might train with a high volume program, select hypertrophy focused exercises, and manipulate all other variables to optimize muscle growth. At a later stage of life, they may be less concerned with maximizing muscle growth, but are now more concerned with lifting for health. So in this case, they may lift with less total volume, implement a little more cardio, and focus on maintaining a healthy body fat. Alternatively, they may decide to train for a powerlifting competition at some stage throughout their lifting career. In this case, they would need to perform the barbell squat, bench press, and deadlift with heavy loads to maximize strength gains. So to summarize this video, let's establish some practical recommendations. We might decide to change our lifting routine for a few different reasons. First is that we can change the exercises we train with. Training a muscle group with multiple exercises in a training routine seems to be beneficial for hypertrophy. Although we ideally want to keep the same exercises in a routine for at least around 6 weeks before switching it with a different variant. We can also change exercises as a way to apply progressive overload by implementing progressively more challenging variations. Another variable we might decide to change over time is volume. Generally, training with more volume tends to produce greater muscle growth, and increasing volume over time can be a way to increase the rate of muscle growth you achieve. Furthermore, we might increase or decrease our volume at different stages of our lifting careers based on our practical lifestyle constraints. We can also change our training routine to mitigate joint stress. If you are experiencing joint pain or irritation, you can adjust your technique, rep ranges, and exercise selection to mitigate this without compromising the hypertrophic stimulus. From a psychological perspective, changing exercises, your training split, or any other variable can help to increase motivation in some cases. And the last potential reason to change your training routine is based on your training goals. If your goals change over time, you can adjust your lifting routine to accommodate this, whether this be for hypertrophy, strength, athletic performance, or health. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.